am Jacob Hornberger, Libertarian candidate for president. I'm here, as you can see, in my vehicle, driving back to my home state of Virginia. Got 11 or 12-hour drive here from the great state of Alabama, where I attended the Alabama Libertarian Party convention yesterday. I'm talking to you on Sunday, and where I participated in the presidential debate last night. And so I thought I'd give you a little post-debate commentary. Got some hours here to while away. And I can tell you that this debate was absolutely fantastic. It was the absolute epitome of a really professional and friendly debate. The debate moderators were just fantastic. I mean, the model of friendly neutrality. They had no agenda. They asked a fascinating blend of questions that they clearly had put a lot of thought into. And the reason it was fascinating, it was a blend of philosophical questions as well as real world questions. Like, they would ask, what should be the U.S. role in NATO? And everybody would answer. And then the next question would be, what should be the role of government in a society? And so this went on for 2 hours, and it was just, I thought it was one of the best debates I've participated in. Very professional, very serious-minded, but also very friendly. I think it's the model of how a debate should be handled. So I thought I'd share with you a point that I made in my closing statement there. And that is that, 20 years ago, I ran for U.S. Senate in Virginia against one of the most popular governors in the history of the state, John Warner, chairman of the Armed Services Committee. This was just after the 9/11 attacks. This was 2002. And, my position on that issue was that U.S. foreign policy had played a motivating factor in those attacks. And this is the same message that Ron Paul would give in that famous debate 6 years later with Rudy Giuliani and others, where they all went ballistic, and where Ron said, they came over here to kill us because we, referring to the government, went over there and killed them. And they all went ballistic, and ironically, that's where Ron's campaign took off, because there was that huge surge of voters in the Republican Party who realized that he was telling the truth. And so I knew that I would not get one single Republican vote, and I didn't care. Now, the Democrats didn't run anybody, but I knew that that would not inure to my benefit at all. There was no possibility that any Democrat would vote for me, because my set of principles is the same as it is today. I'm calling for the abolition of public schooling, the immediate repeal of Social Security and Medicare. There is no possibility that any Democrat was ever going to vote for me. And then there was a Lyndon LaRouche candidate in the race. So there's no doubt that to the extent that Democrats did vote in this particular race, 100% of them voted for the Lyndon LaRouche candidate. And I came in third with a bare bones, guerrilla kind of campaign, no money, that relied totally on principle, on the same message of principle that I'm running for today. I mean, it's the same set of principles I've held ever since I discovered libertarianism. In fact, I'll give you a funny story, a little digression. One of my critics, and I have a few in this party, recently said that Jacob is anachronistic. He hasn't changed his principles in 20 years, or his positions, in 40 years. And she's right. I haven't. But I consider that a good thing, not a bad thing. But what she's referring to is that I haven't ever adopted the modern libertarian message of reform. Like school vouchers, which of course violate the libertarian non-aggression principle and the pledge we all take, because it's a straight socialist program. It uses taxation to take money from one group of people to fund another group of people, and to improve the government public school system, which itself is a socialist program. Or Social Security privatization, or opt-outs, or gradualism, or off-ramps, or continuing socialism for the next 25 years with Social Security and Medicare, and health savings accounts, and drug war reform, and military reform, monetary reform. These are all the modern things, that reform measures that she feels that I should take or should have taken over the years, which I never have, because I, as you can tell, I have very serious objections to the reform message that has become the standard message in this party. And so, which I'll talk to you about in a minute. But in any event, that was my message in this race. And my critics said, at that time said, he's going to get 0.01 and 0.02. I mean, they were really ridiculing. They were convinced that this message of principle could not garner any votes. Well, at the end of this race, I garnered 7% of the statewide vote. And this is 20 years ago, when hardly anyone knew what libertarianism was all about. And so I proved that there's this big constituency out there that will vote for our package of principles, but will never vote for reform and Republican light. And that's why I keep saying, now I have no doubts that constituency is not only still there, but it's doubled or tripled in size, given the advances that we've made in the last 20 years of advancing libertarianism. So that's why I continue to contend in this race that we don't have to settle for the 1%. I mean, people have gotten very jaded in this party, saying, well, it's 1%. We're going to always get the standard 1%. And that's true with a reform message. Okay, but it's not true with respect to the message that I'm enunciating. I have no doubts that this message can double what I get 20 years ago. And that's why I continue to contend that it is entirely possible to achieve a breakout of 10 to 15%, double what I did 20 years ago, right now, but only with this message of principle, because there's a constituency out there that will vote for this message, but will never vote for reform and Republican light, which is obviously the prevailing sentiment. I mean, I'm not naive. I told the convention last night, I'm not naive. I mean, I wasn't born yesterday. I know I'm swimming upstream here. I know what the prevailing sentiment is reform, this reform message. That's what we've been doing. I told the convention, I said, we've been running presidential campaigns for 20 years now with this reform message. It's become the prevailing sentiment. I know what I'm up against here. I mean, I'm not just trying to seek the nomination. I'm trying to shift the entire philosophy of this party, or at least a critical mass of members of the party, to restore the genuine founding principle of this party and to reject reform and Republican light. In part because it cannot garner votes. Okay, now, our objective here, the primary objective is not to garner votes, but we are a political party. I mean, we're not a membership society, we're not the Kiwanis, we're not a debating society despite all our debates. We're a political party. Generally speaking, political parties are about votes, but not at the expense of principle. Our primary purpose of this party is to lead America to freedom. That's what we're really all about. But in the process, hopefully garner votes. Now, if we were running a campaign of pure principle, and the American voters said, well, we reject this. We don't want your principles, and you get 1%. I can live with that. I mean, you can't control how people are going to react to your philosophy. They don't want libertarianism? Okay. But the problem is when you compromise your principles in order to appease voters, and you still get 1%, that's a problem, okay? And that's essentially what's happened in this party. I mean, look at the evidence. You've got 3 years ago, 1.1% in the presidential race. And just a little over a year ago, you got 2 presidential candidates today that ran for Congress. Chase Oliver in Georgia for Senate, 2%. Mike Tremont, 20th Congressional District in Florida, 1%. With the same message. Their message hasn't changed at all. And now you got 2 Wall Street Journal polls that state that the Libertarian Party presidential candidate gets 1% for 2024. So for all practical purposes, 2024 is over as far as the LP presidential candidate is concerned. Because if people have not changed their minds over the last 3 years, they're not going to be changing their minds over the next 8 or 9 months. Why would they? And so, you have libertarians saying, this is a great opportunity for the LP presidential candidate because there's so much discussed with Biden and Trump. And so their idea is, people will default and vote for the libertarian. It's ridiculous. The 2 Wall Street Journal polls are already showing it's ridiculous. Because 99% of the response to the polls are essentially saying, we don't care how disgusted we are with Biden and Trump, we are not voting for you. Oh, and here's the kicker. California State University has just come out with a brand new poll that states that the Libertarian Party presidential candidate is now down to 0%. Zero. There's actually a zero next to the LP category. I mean, now, I doubt if it's really 0%. It'd be pretty incredible, but I have no doubts that it's like 0.01 to 0.04. They've rounded down, which raises the possibility that the Wall Street Journal polls have rounded up, and that it's like 0.05 or 0.06. And so my point is that this reform message cannot garner votes. It's impossible. Okay? It's just, why? Because there's no constituency for it. There's no natural block of voters out there that are going to vote for this package of reform. It's not going to happen. Now, it's popular in the Republican Party. There's no question about it. But it's not popular over here for the LP presidential candidate. There's no constituency. In other words, like take immigration. The idea is that if the Libertarian Party presidential candidate adopts the Republican position in favor of immigration controls, that there'll be this huge surge of votes for the Libertarian Party presidential candidate. They haven't thought it through. See, it's actually zero. That position garners 0 votes. And that stuns the element in the party that favors immigration controls. They can't believe I'm saying this because they say, no, most Americans favor this system. Yeah, true. But all those votes go to Donald Trump. 0 votes go to the LP presidential candidate. Why would they waste their vote on the LP guy? It makes no sense. They're all going to vote for Trump. Now, take my position of open borders, and I'm the only candidate who favors the genuine libertarian position of open borders. There is a huge number of voters out there, including Hispanics, that are just horrified after 80 years of crisis and death and suffering and police state activity on the border. I mean, I grew up on the border, and I lived almost half my life there, and I can tell you, there's a lot of people who do not like the border patrol on the border. But they don't know that there's a viable alternative. If they hear a viable alternative, and the only viable alternative is open borders, I've been saying this for more than 30 years, there is no other solution. This is a socialist system, immigration controls. It's based on the socialist principle of central planning. That's the root cause of the crisis. You want to get rid of the crisis? Get rid of the cause of the crisis. Just like the drug war. You want to get rid of the cartels? Legalize drugs. There's no other solution. And when this group of people who are horrified by this learn that there's a viable alternative, and if there's anybody that could present this viable alternative, it's me. I mean, I've been making this case for open borders for over 30 years. The religious case, the economic case, the moral case, everything. They will leap at it. I have no doubts. Those are my voters. That's my block of voters that my opponents in this race cannot get, because they're never going to vote for a Libertarian Party advocate of this system, whether they're an easy advocate of the system and they want the government to go easy, let in more immigrants, or close the border, whatever. They're not going to go to the polls to vote for the LP presidential candidate. That's your 1%. But I can get that big vote. Now, let me explain, part of what's going on here, because, and let me explain it in terms of Chase's race. Now, whenever I talk about Chase's race in these debates, he gets very defensive. He thinks I'm criticizing his campaign, but I'm not. I'm actually, heaping accolades on his campaign. I mean, Chase got more publicity than ever any candidate in the history of this party. So his campaign is very instructive as to the point I'm making here, that a reform-oriented message cannot garner votes. It's inherently defective, because he got this massive publicity, ABC, New York Times, Washington Post, Atlanta Journal-Constitution, because he was the swing vote that was causing a runoff between the incumbent Raphael Warnock and the Democrat, the Democrat Warnock, and then the Republican Herschel Walker. So the byproduct of this is like $20-30 million of advertising, free advertising for Chase. This is a Libertarian Party's candidate's dream. I mean, how often do you hear questions being asked, how do you intend to get publicity? How do you intend to get publicity for your message? Chase got it. I mean, he got his message out to every single voter in Georgia. And then he got in the debates. How often do you hear that point being made. How do we get in the debates, Jacob? If we had gotten our presidential candidate in the debates, everything would be different. Well, I doubt that, because I believe that the reason we get the 1% is the message. So if you get your message out to the voters that they don't like, the result's going to be the same. And so Chase gets into the debates, or one debate that was widely advertised, televised statewide. Everybody was watching. The whole nation was watching this race. This was going to decide the control of the Senate. So Chase gets in the debate with an incumbent U.S. Senator, Raphael Warnock. Walker wouldn't appear, and so here's Warnock says, I'll debate the Libertarian. And so you can watch the debate there. The debate moderators were the epitome of neutrality, of professionalism, of courtesy. I mean, it was fascinating. They treated Chase like an equal to Warnock. They were very, very courteous. They gave him equal time. It was a fascinating phenomenon, because usually you're accustomed to the press ridiculing and mocking Libertarian Party candidates. Not this time. And in this debate, which you can watch online, Chase got his message out to every single voter in Georgia. Now, what was that message? It was the very model of reform. I mean, you couldn't find a better presentation of the reform message that has become dominant in this party than what Chase presented in that debate. FDA reform, Medicaid reform, Social Security reform, immigration reform. The duopoly isn't working. Smaller government, smaller ATF, smaller DEA, smaller Pentagon, smaller whatever. He's going to read the bills, and he's going to end the ranked partisanship in Washington. He's going to sit down with Democrats and Republicans and figure out solutions to immigration and so forth. The very model of the reform message that has become dominant and the prevailing sentiment. At the end of this, he gets 2% of the vote. But you see, there's no soul searching in the party. Says, wait, what happened here? Why? If he got his message out to every voter in Georgia, why wasn't he elected? Indeed, why did he only get 2%? That's where the soul searching is needed in this party. Now, I guarantee you, it wasn't because the voters said, this guy's a jerk, I don't like this guy. Because everybody likes Chase Sullivan. I mean, you can't help but like the guy. He's very animated. He does all these meet and greets, and he did meet and greets all across Georgia, and he's very, very passionate about libertarianism. And so you can't help but like the guy. But at the end of it, 2% of the statewide race. Okay. Why? Because this message of reform cannot garner votes. There's no constituency out there for it. Same thing with Mike Tremont. Now, Mike didn't have the massive publicity Chase did, but he did get in the debates there in Florida with the same message. I mean, these guys have not changed their message. It's the same message they're running on today. And so it's the 1% message, and Mike gets 1% of the vote. And again, you can't help but like Mike Tremont. He was one of the nicest guys I've ever met. And so that couldn't be a factor in why people didn't vote for him. They didn't vote for him because they don't like this message. And this is what we need to confront this party. This is not a good message if you're thinking about votes, but it's also not a good message with respect to just what our party stands for. Because it's all reform. It's reforming message. Reforming the welfare state. Reforming. This is not freedom. Freedom necessarily means dismantling infringements on freedom, not reforming them. Reforming slavery would not have been freedom for slaves. Okay? You've got to dismantle infringements on freedom, not reform, and therefore you've got to make the case for dismantling to the American people if we're going to do our job. And that's lead America to freedom. That's our job, to lead America to freedom. And so what I'm saying is that if we're going to do that, it can only be done with this campaign of principle. Now let me return to my race in North Carolina, because that 7% didn't just happen. Okay, now, I didn't have any money. Bare bones campaign. I have no doubts that if I'd had money and a lot of massive publicity, if I'd gotten to the debate with Warnock, I would have gotten at least 10% and maybe even doubled that 7%. But I thought through this campaign beforehand. I knew what I wanted to do, and so this was a classic guerrilla campaign without a lot of money. I found out where all the black events were, black voters, targeted black voters, because for decades, I've been arguing that the drug war is the most racially bigoted government program in history. Well, second to segregation and, of course, slavery. But, I mean, this is a horrific government program. And the people that say there's not institutionalized racism in America, it's full of bull. I mean, this government program is riddled with racism. There's no question blacks get disproportionately higher sentences in drug cases. They get stopped more. I'm not saying every judge and every DEA agent, officer, drug war officer is a bigot, but I'm saying there are some in there, and boy, they love this thing. And so I targeted black voters, and I found out where their concerts were and their picnics, and I went out to everything, and I shook hands, and I passed out my campaign card. And then I made an appointment with one of the most prominent black ministers in the country, a man named John O. Peterson. This man, very, very prestigious, and he agreed to receive me. I was amazed, and he didn't know me from Adam. And we made an appointment. He got elected to the African American Hall of Fame. He was minister at the Alfred Street Baptist Church in Alexandria. And I went in there and I said, Pastor Peterson, I want to tell you where I stand in this race. And I told him, I laid it out, open borders, abolish Social Security and Medicare immediately and all other socialist programs, abolish public schooling, dismantle the whole military empire, and everything I stand for now, or most everything. And at the end of this conversation, he looks at me and he says, Mr. Hornberger, I'm going to endorse your candidacy. And he writes out a letter of endorsement. He says, you take this to every black minister in the state, you tell them I'm endorsing you. And I did. And I drove all over the state, met with black ministers, and showed them this letter. I mean, it's one of the biggest honors I've received in my entire history as the libertarian movement and in this party. And so there's no doubt in my mind that the lion's share of my 7% came from black voters. But I also targeted Hispanic voters. See, I didn't target Republican voters. Those are the standard, targeted audience of the reform message people in the party. You hear them say, this is the party of Ron Paul. This is the story of Ron Paul. Well, it's not. Ron Paul was a Republican when he got that big surge of votes. And the fantasy has always been that those Republicans, who are well-to-do people, middle-class people, are going to come over here and cross party lines and vote for the Libertarian. It's never going to happen. They're not going to cross party lines to come over here. If they would have, Joe would have gotten more than 1%. They're going to stay in the Republican Party, the same as libertarians would stay in the party. Like when Bill Weld was being honored, groomed to be the 2020 candidate, there's a lot of people, especially in the party hierarchy, that were honoring him and praising him, and they were grooming him to be the 2020 candidate. And then he goes back to the Republican Party, and not one of them followed him. Why? Party loyalty. So this fantasy that the Ron Paul voters are going to come over is just pure bull. So I never targeted Republican voters. It's just a fool's errand. But I did target black voters, and I targeted Hispanic voters. I went out there and met with them, and I told them I'm favoring open borders. Libre comercio, libre migración, quiero abrir todas las fronteras. And you wouldn't believe the reaction on their faces. I found that, the Hispanic neighborhoods, the newspaper editors and so forth, and they were shocked. I mean, they'd never heard this idea, but they said, ojalá, if only, hopefully. And I had no doubt. Those are my voters, you see. My opponents can't garner those votes because they all support immigration controls in one form or another. They're never going to get these voters that are sick and tired of the death and the suffering and the concertina wire and the police state along the border. I spent almost half my life on the border. I can tell you, there are people down there that do not like the Border Patrol. Okay? Those are my voters. I mean, there's a sentiment that immigration controls are this great vote getter, but they're not. Because, like I've said over and over again, the right-wing proponents of immigration controls are going to vote for Trump. They're never going to vote for the Libertarian. They're not going to waste their vote on the Libertarian. But my voters are the people that will vote for open borders. And that's, I have no doubt, it's a big block of voters. This is why I keep saying, we have the potential in this party, with our principles, to achieve that 10 to 15% breakout. Double what I did 20 years ago. but only with these principles. Open borders, dismantle the thing. Now, also, the 50% of people who don't vote. I mean, that's a big block of voters. And why don't they vote? Because many of them are totally disgusted with the system, and rightly so. But they will never vote for reform in Republican light. If they were, we wouldn't be at 1%. But when they see a libertarian candidate says dismantle this, dismantle that, dismantle the whole thing, they're not going to vote for partial. They're not going to look at a candidate and say, well, he wants to partially dismantle, but wants to keep the immigration police state. No, it's got to be the full package. And so this is what my central contention is. That if you want votes, and let's face it, we're a Republican Party. If you want a big breakout in votes, there's only one way to do that. It cannot be done through this reform message that is the prevailing dominant sentiment of this party that I'm swimming upstream against, no doubt about it. But that is not the biggest reason why we should be running a campaign of principle. And I'm talking about our original founding principles, not these newfangled reform positions, all of which violate the libertarian non-aggression principle and the pledge we take. The big reason is that reform is not freedom. Okay, now my critics say, oh, Jacob, you're just trying to prove you're more libertarian. No, that's a ridiculous attack. How would you even measure such a thing? Is a person that calls for drug legalization and supports immigration controls more principled than the opposite? How would you measure it? No, what I'm saying is that reform is not freedom, any more than reform of slavery would have been considered freedom for slaves. Reform is reform. It keeps the infringements on freedom intact. It leads at best to a better serfdom. If you want to achieve freedom, you've got to dismantle every single infringement of freedom, not reform. So what I'm saying is that, my campaign is difficult. I mean, I'm not just running for the nomination. It's easy to run for a nomination when you hold the popular sentiment. It's much more difficult when you realize I'm trying to shift a critical mass of people to understanding that our principles are our greatest asset. That's what I said last night. They're not a liability. They're not an albatross. These are the weapons that we need to be taking into battle against Democrats and Republicans. This will not only achieve a massive breakout in votes, 10 to 15%, but this is what we need to lead America to freedom. And that's our job. I'm Jacob Hornberger, Libertarian candidate for president. My campaign website is jacobforliberty.com.